Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Genzer, and I'm General Counsel to the Neuro Rights Foundation, a new nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote innovation, protect human rights, and to ensure the ethical development of neurotechnology. With me today are my colleagues, Dr. Rafael Yuste, a neurobiologist, director of Columbia University's Neurotechnology Lab, and the chair of our board, Stephanie Herman, a fellow international human rights lawyer, and Jamie Daves, an entrepreneur and strategist who's co-founder and managing partner of Everyone Inc. We are delighted to welcome you to our first public event, the first of many we expect, which is the launch of our landmark report entitled International Human Rights Protection Gaps in the Age of Neurotechnology. Our report is the first comprehensive review of international human rights law as applied to neurotechnology. Neurotechnology, defined as methods to directly record or modify human brain activity, is an emerging source of medical and scientific advancement, economic development, and consumer demand. The brain is the source of human mental and cognitive processes, imagination, perception, and memory. The privacy of our thoughts or our memories, our ability to make free decisions, and even our own personality and identity are potentially up for grabs. This is not science fiction. This is science. But the impact of neurotechnology is more than just on privacy. Because it directly interacts with the brain, neurotechnology is expected to profoundly alter what it means to be human. International human rights treaties are a useful framework for thinking about how to address protection gaps, both because they are legally binding upon the states that ratify them, and they provide broad language that get at how the misuse and abuse of neurotechnology will affect people. Concepts such as dignity, liberty, and security of the person, and a right to equality. But without the continued development of international human rights law, there are today a wide array of, quote, gaps in human rights protection, which leave people vulnerable and without recourse for potential violations. Let me now turn it over to Dr. Yuste, who co-authored our report and is one of the most well-regarded and distinguished leaders in the field of neurobiology and neurotechnology. He'll provide further background on what neurotechnology is, the benefits it can provide to humanity, as well as the ways in which it can be misused or abused. And he'll provide further context for his work with the Morningside Group, which identified 5 specific proposed neuro rights that underpin the analysis in our report today. Rafa.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those of you in Europe, or good evening those of you in Asia. So I'm Rafael Yuste. I'm an MD and a researcher. And as you heard, I have a laboratory that studies how the brain works at Columbia University, and I'm also the chairman of the Neuro Rights Foundation. So the reason we're here is because the brain is not just another organ of the body, but it's the organ that generates all of our mental and cognitive activities. So our mind, the human mind, which defines who we are, doesn't come out of thin air. It's the result of the activity of about 100 billion neurons that we have in our brains. And this is the focus of neuroscience. And neurotechnology are methods that could be electrical, they could be optical, magnetic, acoustical, chemical, to do 2 things: to either record the activity of these vast neural networks in laboratory animals or in humans, or to change the activity of these networks, to alter the activity of the network. So that's the only thing that neurotechnology does. Record, you can imagine reading, and change, which is like writing. No? And neurotechnological devices are of 2 kinds. They could be invasive, that require neurosurgery inserted into the brain of animals or people, or non-invasive, that you can wear like a helmet, like a pair of glasses, like a diadem, some sort of headgear. So why is neurotechnology important? Because again, since the brain is not just another organ, this technology, by definition, will enable or enables the recording and altering of brain activity, which means that it makes it possible to record and alter mental activity. So this is something that is not science fiction. This happens, for instance, in laboratory animals. A laboratory like mine, we use optical neurotechnology using infrared lasers to decode the activity of the visual cortex of the mouse, and we can actually figure out what the mouse is looking at by just recording its so brain activity. And we can also use writing neurotechnology, also optical, to specifically activate patterns of neurons in the visual cortex and insert in a way into his vision artificial images, things that he's not seeing. And the mouse behaves as if he's seeing these things. So this proves to you the power of neurotechnology. We can effectively, as neuroscientists with laboratory animals, now for a few years, we can effectively decode and manipulate brain activity with pinpoint precision. So in humans, neurotechnology has been used in the clinic. In basic neurotechnology, that includes cochlear implants, deep brain stimulation, brain-computer interfaces are used by tens of thousands of patients in the US and many more around the world to alleviate symptoms of mental and neurological diseases. Neurotechnology is an essential tool to figure out how the brain works, and understanding how the brain works is absolutely critical in order to understand and cure all the mental and neurological diseases, which I'm sure every one of you is familiar with from personal experience with family members or friends. So this is all fantastic. In fact, neurotechnology has been embraced by the world, by all the industrialized nations. The President Obama in 2013 launched the US Brain Initiative, and that's the unofficial birth of the new era of neurotechnology that currently funds more than 550 laboratories around the world. And it's funded, it's going to be lasting for approximately 15 years with an estimated budget of about $6 billion. And the US Brain Initiative stimulated similar initiatives in other countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Europe, Canada, and Israel. So we're talking about a global investment in neurotechnology for three reasons: for scientific reasons, to understand how the brain works; for medical reasons, to help patients; and also for economic reasons, because the perception from the industry is that neurotechnology will make possible non-invasive brain-computer interfaces to connect ourselves to the net, as opposed to using our little fingers on an iPhone. We'd be able to essentially have a bidirectional connection with the net through a brain-computer interface. Because of this and the power of neurotechnology demonstrated in laboratory animals, many groups of people around the world have raised the spectrum of ethical and societal consequences of neurotechnology. And that started even with the earliest proposal to President Obama for the Brain Initiative in 2011, the proposal that I was part of, where we raised the issue that the development of new technology, as important as it is, should go hand in hand with the development of ethical and societal guidelines for the deployment of this new technology in the society, because it affects what it means to be human, which is our human mind. Our human mind defines who we are. So there's wide consensus among at least 20 different groups of people that have published reports in support of ethical guidelines for neurotechnology. And this includes groups of experts, including the Morningside group that I help lead with Sarah Goring from the University of Washington, as you've heard, the Society for Neuroscience, the IEEE, the Brain Initiative itself, the International Brain Initiative that encompasses all the brain initiatives. There's also different countries that have jumped in and propose or are in earlier stages of discussing regulation of neurotechnology, including Chile, who actually amended its constitution to make brain activity and the information that comes from brain activity protected as a basic right of the Chilean citizen. Spain, who launched a digital rights charter that incorporates neurotechnology protection, the so-called Neuro rights that you heard about. And then there's early efforts in the US, in the EU, Argentina, even Kenya is interested in this topic. And then there are international organizations like UNESCO, OECD, the G7, GESTA, and the United Nations. So the Secretary General has taken a personal interest in neurotechnology. And in fact, in his common agenda that he published last year after his re-election, as one of his priorities for the UN for the next 6 years, it's the revamping of the human rights framework with respect to frontier issues, and it specifically mentions neurotechnology. The consensus for ethical regulation of guidelines for neurotechnology is also shared by the industry. We organized 2 meetings last year, inviting to the Neuro Rights Foundation representative of all the major neurotech companies in the US, and pretty much all were represented, and every person to the man agreed that the industry agreed that we need ethical guidelines, with some sort of guidelines to develop this technology. And even Hollywood has discovered this issue. There is a upcoming documentary that will be released later this year from Werner Herzog on this issue. And there's been also news programs like Vice and other news venues have focused on ethical issues of neurotechnology. So everyone agrees there's a problem. We need ethical issues. The question is, what do we do? How do we come up with some sort of ethical issues? Now, my opinion, and the opinion of the group that I represent, is that this is a human rights issue. Actually, the way I would put it is that if this is not a human rights issue, you have a technology that can actually access and filter your mental activity. If this is not a human rights issue, what is a human rights issue? Because again, the brain builds the mind, and the mind defines who you are. That's the essence of our humanity. So if human rights, as you've heard from Jared, it's a very positive instrument for change in the world, in spite that not everyone agrees with human rights, and the world is not perfect, and there are always countries that will remain outside the human rights framework. If you look at the history of human rights, it's actually quite impressive. So we think it's a very useful framework to approach neurotechnology, and further interpretation of international human rights law could be very helpful to define guidelines that would be global and that could actually let us agree on what type of human being we want to be. And then with that agreement, it's like putting guardrails on the future and make sure that neurotechnology grows and develops and delivers its promise, helping humanity with understanding how the brain works, helping cure brain diseases, and also opening new avenues for the economy. So if this is a human rights issue, there's 2 questions. And the first question is, are we covered with the existing human rights? Are we all set with what we have, or do we need new human rights? Or do we need to amend human rights? And the next issue is like, what's next? How do you do that? And what are the next steps? And to answer those questions, I'm going to take the ball to my colleagues, Jared Kentz and Stephanie Herman, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafa, for those opening remarks. Before I provide a little further background on our report, let me just make tangible what we're talking about. And one of the things I think that a lot of people are very interested in is developments in mind reading technology. This is not science fiction, this is science, and it's science today. Last year, a study was published about a new technology with an implantable brain-computer interface that now enables a paralyzed nonverbal person to communicate at 20 words a minute with 99% accuracy, exclusively by reading their thoughts. And as Rafa informs us, what can be done today with an implantable BCI will be possible in several years with a wearable BCI. So we don't know whether that's 3 years, 5 years or so, but it's not 10 years or 20 years. It is coming and coming fast. And one can just imagine, using this one illustration, as to how this kind of technology could be used, for example, when it is a wearable brain-computer interface in the interrogation of political dissidents or criminal suspects, or for a wide array of nefarious purposes. It could also, of course, be used for very positive ends, medical ends, as I just described, but also even imagine being able to do word processing by thinking of the sentences you want to put on the screen and being able to do that. So, this technology, of course, is value neutral, but could be used for both good and more worrying purposes. And we've already seen misuse of more rudimentary neurotechnology. A company called BrainCo, for example, provided wearable brain-computer interfaces into China, and the Chinese government actually put on children BCIs without the permission of their parents that were monitoring their brain state and whether or not they were concentrating. And the teacher at the front of the room could tell whether or not they were concentrating by looking at a screen and seeing a red light or a green light as to whether or not they were concentrating. BCIs have also been used in Chinese factories to monitor, people working on the line and whether or not they're concentrating, and that's been used to fire people that they believe are not as efficient as they should be. And so all of this, demonstrates that there could be both very positive benefits of neurotech as well as worrying ones. And undoubtedly, there are a lot of potential misuses and abuses of neurotechnology by states, industry, and non-state actors that will need to be examined and managed to the maximum extent possible. Moving forward, developing a common approach to address these risks through the United Nations, further interpretation of current international human rights treaties, new soft law standards for states and neurotechnology companies, as well as broader public education, would put the international community in the best position to confront and fill these gaps. And advancing these efforts will also provide a foundation for the development of new legal and regulatory frameworks that will be adopted at a national level around the world. As has already been mentioned, has begun in Chile and Spain. The Neuro Rights Foundation has authored international human rights protection gaps in the age of neurotechnology, both to propose a path forward for the UN in leading global efforts to protect human rights as neurotechnology becomes more widely available, and to analyze ways in which existing international treaties fail to address novel human rights challenges in the neurotechnological age, or so-called neuro rights. As mentioned, the 5 neuro rights that we've been focusing on examining whether human rights treaties might provide for them or not include the right to mental identity or sense of self, the right to mental agency or free will, the right to mental privacy, the right to fair access to mental augmentation, and protection from algorithmic bias. And our report assesses how well these rights are protected by provisions in 7 relevant existing international human rights treaties. Among other findings, our report shows that current international human rights treaties are ill-prepared to protect neuro rights and will require further interpretation to ensure their applicability. We also found through an analysis of existing regional standards that the proposed neuro rights represent the beginning of a global consensus on how to characterize the misuse and abuse of neurotechnology. Both of these findings signal the importance of further interpreting international human rights law to more clearly encompass neuro rights. And I'll now pass things over to my colleague and co-author, Stephanie Herman, who will discuss additional findings in the analytical sections of our report.
Thank you, Jared. And I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Herman, and I'm an international human rights lawyer at Perseus Strategies and the Neuro Rights Foundation. And just to reiterate some of what we're discussing here today, the importance of using international human rights law as a frame for understanding the human rights challenges of neurotechnology, I would say provides 3 primary benefits. The first is that international human rights law is legally binding on states that ratify international human rights treaties. As Jared mentioned, there are a number of other agreements that are pervading in the world on neurotechnology, but none of them to date are legally binding on the states that agree to them or on the organizations that are party to them. And so using the language and the vehicles for international human rights law helps ensure that the human rights challenges of neurotechnology are sufficiently addressed. The next point of value is that the UN Human Rights Committees, which are the adjudicatory bodies for these international human rights treaties, help provide a forum where claims against states can be brought. And so where states violate human rights in a way that is contrary to those treaties, there is a place for people to have an opportunity to be heard. And then the third value is that these treaties often require states parties to implement legislation that is consistent with their obligations under the treaty. And so when we talk about getting into the regulatory space, especially as consumer neurotechnology starts to pervade global markets, this is really critical because states then have to enact regulations that help ensure the ethical development and safe and efficacious use of neurotechnology. So with that said, what our report ultimately finds is that under an analysis of 7 existing UN-authored international human rights treaties, they are currently ill-equipped to address the human rights challenges of neurotechnology. Our methodology for assessing this is to go through the provisions of each treaty and understand which articles arguably already address the neuro rights or the ways that experts have characterized the human rights challenges of neurotechnology, articles of these treaties which might be further interpreted to include the neuro rights, and articles which do not yet address any of the human rights challenges conceivably posed, conceivably posed by neurotechnology. And what we have found after conducting this analysis is that ultimately this system is currently ill-equipped because although there is language under international human rights law to describe the neuro rights, the law itself needs to be further interpreted to explicitly include that. So as an example, I'll illustrate both an article from a convention that does address some of these gaps and one that does not. For instance, Article 5 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is interpreted to include a right of equal access to, quote, assistive technologies. That clause is broadly written enough to encompass neurotechnology should it be considered an assistive technology. At the same time, Article 9 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights addresses the right to liberty and security of the person, and security of the person has been interpreted by the UN Human Rights Committee to include a right to be free from injury, bodily and mental, but it doesn't address scenarios where a brain-computer interface might be worn and leave no trace of injury or leave no trace of any harm. And that particular gap also applies to treaties like the Convention Against Torture, where it's unclear whether using such a piece of neurotechnology would meet the threshold for pain and suffering. And although it appears that the Committee Against Torture doesn't require explicitly proof of an injury, particularly a mental one, failing to prevent such evidence may disadvantage a complainant in bringing a claim before that body. And so in going through all of these treaties, we suggest ways in which international human rights law that already exists could be further interpreted to either explicitly mention neurotechnology or to address scenarios in which neurotechnology may be used that are not outlined in existing versions of the neuro rights. The second primary finding of this report is that the neuro rights framework, as Jared mentioned, is a growing source of conceptual consensus for characterizing how neurotechnology uniquely affects human rights. So I mentioned that there are concepts in international human rights law like dignity, liberty, security of the person, and so on, that can be further interpreted to address neurotechnology. At the same time, the ways in which we characterize the human rights challenges of neurotechnology differ among all of these different regional agreements and frameworks that help try to address this in a non-binding way. And so bringing to bear definitions through the United Nations that are centralized and enshrined in hard law that binds the states that ratify these treaties is a way to help ensure that these gaps are closed universally and not just under one body of law or as a one-off example of an agreement in one part of the world. I also want to share two quick thoughts on which rights are best protected and worst protected under existing international human rights law. The first is that the best protected neuro right is the right to agency and followed by freedom from algorithmic bias. The neuro right to agency, or the sense of free will, is at least somewhat protected under the language of existing international human rights treaties, including the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because there's at least some language describing freedom of choice and direct attempts by an individual to interact with their surroundings. But often what these treaties fail to address is indirect methods of coercion or persuasion or things that are tacitly done and of which individuals may not be aware, such as surveillance. And those gaps are further analyzed in the rest of the report. But it's at least somewhat present in those treaties. And the neuro right to be free from algorithmic bias is one that the international community and that international human rights law is already somewhat aware of because there are so many rights about freedom to equality, equal access, and freedom from discrimination. At least the language of those treaties and their accompanying general comments or interpretations somewhat already address this right. Our final conclusion is that the worst protected neuro right is the right of identity, or the sense of self. It's been found in a study on brain-computer interfaces published in Frontiers in Neuroscience and cited in Nature that individuals who use deep brain electrodes can find that they have a disrupted sense of self. Now, where that is used as a treatment, that's clearly a necessary context in which neurotechnology is being used, but the notion that this kind of technology can disrupt your sense of self, or as the Morningside group put it, give you behaviors that you can struggle to claim as your own is certainly a worrying concept that might be misused or abused through neurotechnology. And so coming up with stronger language around how to describe identity formation and retention will be necessary in international human rights law. And that can be further interpreted under treaties such as the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But ultimately what this report finds is that there are clear protection gaps under all of these treaties, and it requires that international human rights law be further interpreted so that these neuro rights, among others, are fully and comprehensively addressed, such that states are legally required, if they're parties to these treaties, to adopt regulations that help ensure the ethical development of neurotechnology at home. So addressing international human rights law has huge ramifications, both at the global stage in centralizing definitions and marshaling organizations behind protecting neuro rights, as well as in helping national governments ensure that their industries are likewise compliant. And with that, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Jared Genzer, to talk about the UN's next steps in leadership.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Before just briefly concluding with our overall recommendations about how to advance UN engagement on this, let me just kind of, for practical terms, because I know there are a lot of people that are not lawyers on the line, illustrate why advancing international human rights law specifically can have such a big effect on outcomes in ways that soft law standards, which are not binding on states or anyone else, do not. So let me just give an example of one of the recommendations that we have for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And if you look at the right to freedom of thought and conscience, it historically has been defined as the right to be free from arbitrary interference with your thought and conscience. But when the treaty itself was written in the 1970s, of course, nobody had any idea that you might be able to one day read a person's thoughts. And so, for example, there's no right of mental privacy, a right to mental privacy incorporated in the interpretation of that provision. It really stops at external interference on your thought and conscience. And so if the treaty body that interprets that treaty, appointed by the more than 170 countries in the world that are party to it, were to say that the freedom of thought and conscience in the 21st century also includes a right to mental privacy, because that treaty itself requires all states parties that are party to it to bring their local law, their national law into compliance with the obligations of the treaty. The moment that this treaty body were to say, as a declaration, as a general comment, as it's referred to, that there is a right of mental privacy, all 170 countries in the world would then need to domestically legislate and protect mental privacy from abuses by states and non-state actors. And so this is one way to kind of shortcut the international lawmaking process, which, for example, if one were to talk about creating a new treaty on this topic, could easily take 10 years or more to ultimately conclude. So let me just now briefly bring our part of the presentation to a conclusion by sharing on the screen here a one-page slide that summarizes what ultimately we've recommended needs to be done. You can see in the upper left under leadership, the different parts of the international system that we believe need to be engaged to protect neuro rights, as well as, of course, mentioning governments in the private sector as well. In the bottom left, you'll see some new institutional architecture that we're recommending. We'd like to see the Secretary General create a new high-level panel or expert group on this topic, which would provide a way for the UN machinery to study and look at these issues, engage widely with civil society, with the private sector, and otherwise. We mentioned the possibility of a new UN Special Rapporteur on neurotechnology and human rights. And of course, we'd like to see top UN officials having advisors that are experts on these types of challenges and issues as well. On the right, when you look at the strategies that we're recommending, I'll just briefly run through them. The UN Secretary General has already taken a leadership role here. Recently, there was the second expert panel on neurotechnology and human rights that was convened in a private meeting by the UN, and the Secretary General's office and the Secretary General himself are personally engaged. And so we think this needs to continue. Stephanie talked a lot more about how treaty bodies can adopt or amend general comments to key treaties to further interpret and address gaps. We talked about the UN Human Rights Council as an institution that could work towards a resolution and eventually a special rapporteur. The General Assembly can work towards a resolution. Again, these are soft law standards, so they're not binding, but they can provide at least a common and consensus-based approach for definitions of the technology and of the neuro rights themselves that can contribute towards this process of further interpreting human rights treaties. There is a UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and also the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has something called the Btec Project, and these two approaches are looking at the guiding principles for business and human rights that were adopted a number of years ago, and provide, again, non-binding, but helpful guidance as to how companies should look at the ethical impacts of their work. And we talk about how these guiding principles need to be specifically addressed in the context of advancing neurotechnology and emerging technologies more generally. And then lastly, we talk about the need for UN organs and agencies and their leaders to promote public education and awareness raising. So these are the overall conclusions of the report that we have put together. You all received with the information on the Zoom link, the link to the report itself, which will shortly be up on the Neuro Foundation website. And we'll of course be sending around after this a link to this video as well. But let me conclude there, and then I'm going to hand it over now to Jamie Daves, who is a board member and co-founder of the Neuro Rights Foundation, who will facilitate our Q&A. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Jared. Hi, everyone. So if you have seen the chat box, there's going to be two ways that we're going to interact. One is if you want to go ahead and write a question into the chat box, we'll begin to sequence them and respond to them. If you can, please try to direct it just to start with, maybe to one of the individual panelists specifics, and then if others want to respond, they can respond as well, and try to keep them concise. The other thing you can do, for those familiar with Zoom, is you can use the reactions button and you can raise your hand if you want to do that. So either write it in the chat box and we'll respond in kind that way verbally, or and other people can add context in the chat box, or raise your hand and then we'll acknowledge you. Again, please try to keep it directed to a person and try to keep it concise. And if for some reason that's too much tech, just go ahead and say, hey, I have a question. That'll be the third way we'll do it. Okay, so go ahead. Who wants to go first, if anyone? Don't be shy and make it hard. I know we have some academics here, so this is the class. Who's going to start us off? And
we've got two hands, Jamie.
Oh, I don't. Maybe somebody can help me direct, because I haven't seen those yet.
Katrina, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Well, I am going to ask sort of a general question that does not come really from an academic perspective. So I'm going to bring it back to that very human perspective of the human rights community. And that is, how do you think you can best break through to the wide circle of people who are just going to find this all kind of terrifying in many ways? Because I think that is the instinctive reaction of a lot of people, myself included, when you think about the potential of technology literally to invade that last sacred sanctum, sort of our mind and our thoughts. And obviously, I think that the purpose of this report and this initiative is incredibly important. But I guess I think you have sort of an emotional intelligence job, not simply a technical job of thinking, how do we change treaties and how do we, manage this technology? But I really think that is also going to need to be addressed, because I'm sure I'm not alone in having that reaction of just saying this feels scary and exciting at the same time, and implausible and wonderful and horrible. So I'm sorry, Jamie and Jared, to start out with a decidedly non-academic and technical question, but that's those are sort of the thoughts.
Katrina, do you want to identify yourself also, just so that
Sure. I'm Katrina Lantos-Sweat. I'm president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. And I'll throw out one more thing again, not so much a question, but just something to prompt further thought and reaction. Among the various things I've done is I also served as chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I think that this whole sphere of neurotechnology and neuro rights really intersects with Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. And how does one secure conscience rights in a world where it may be possible for technology to read our minds, and can it also read our hearts?
Can I take the question?
Yeah, go ahead,
Katrina, thanks a lot for your question. Technologies are neutral. Okay, this is from the fire. Imagine just the first person that discovers the fire. That, oh, we can survive the winter. We can warm up, or we can burn the cave of the guys next door. So, as scientists that are in the middle of this technology development, for again scientific and medical reasons, I can tell you just my own story. I started as an MD in Spain, and it was rotating in the psychiatry wards where they shipped me to a hospital where they had the paranoid schizophrenics, and they were essentially a jail. We had to interview them with bodyguards because they were dangerous, but these were super smart people. In fact, I would argue that probably the model for Sherlock Holmes was the paranoid schizophrenic. And you can just, the impotence of knowing that they have spectacular brains and there's something in there. It's like a switch that's off. No, we have the urgency to go and help people with mental and neurological diseases. They look at us in the eyes every day. No? Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression. I mean, people that commit suicide, stroke patients, paralyzed patients, mental discapacitation, I mean, handicap. This is just our duty. No, we have to. This is just our duty, and we work 24/7 in neuroscience around the world to find the secrets of how the brain works to help patients. No? But at the same time, we see the future coming, so we cannot just stop because, well, the same tool that can help a schizophrenic and reprogram the brain of schizophrenic can be used to reprogram the brain of someone who's normal. No? So that's the reason that we're doing what we're doing. That's the reason people like me, is like a lab scientist, is sitting here with someone like Jared and Stephanie, who are expert human rights lawyers, because we have to alert society of what's coming, and we have to put the ethical framework to make sure that this happens in a way which is nurturing for the progress and the future of humanity. We don't stop it, no? But at the same time, we can channel it in a rational way. It's a little bit making the decision: what type of human being do we want to be? No? What are the essence, the tenets of what makes us human? And we codify that in the human rights law. No? And then with that in place, we're driving the plane. We know exactly where we're going as a society, and technology companies can develop whatever they want as long as they're in the same plane. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very, very clear and frankly, very reassuring answer. Thank you.
Francesco, you have had your hand up. Would you like to go next?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting to me. And I am a PhD student from the University of Milano Bicocca in Italy. And I study neuroscience and neuro rights related to, neuroscience related to law in general. And so I have a more academic question, if I can. I don't know to who give this question, but maybe someone will answer. But I'm curious to know if in this document that you presented, or in the near future, you are planning to address some of the problems that some academics find in the proposal of the 5 neuro rights that the Neuro Rights Foundation proposed. Because some people in the academia in general, they say that there is a risk of an inflation of human rights, and how can we address this? And I would like to know your opinion on this point. Thanks.
I can take a first crack at it. I mean, I think, look, I mean, I'm an international human rights lawyer. I've been practicing human rights for 20 years. And so I actually think that by filling the gaps that we're describing in these international human rights treaties, that one can further interpret the treaties to include these neuro rights. So So actually, as the answer to your academic question is actually that we're not adding any new human rights at all. In fact, with my example of thought and conscience, a right to freedom of thought and conscience has long existed. It's existed for 40 years, and it existed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was non-binding going back to 1948. All we're doing is saying that thought and conscience includes a right of mental privacy. Back in 1948 and then in the 70s, when that treaty was developed, nobody knew that you'd ever be able to peer into a person's brain and to for example, see their thoughts. So we're not adding a new international human right of mental privacy. We're interpreting the right of thought and conscience, which has long existed, to include a right of mental privacy. What I would say is that actually the same thing can be said across the 5 neuro rights themselves, that I believe that most of the things that we're going to need to do will be really about further interpreting international treaties to be able to include these neuro rights, rather than coming up with some new set of rights that have never existed up until this moment in time.
I would just like to,
sorry,
thanks very much.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I would just like to quickly add to that, in driving the definitions of these particular neuro rights, we certainly recognize that there are other definitions and other sets of neuro rights that have been put forward. But the idea is that in creating a consensus on how to characterize or how to best characterize the potential misuse and abuse of neurotechnology, then we can give new language and new conceptual thinking, which are sorely needed under international human rights law, to the ways in which these treaties have already been interpreted. And so just to add to what Jared has already said, further interpreting terms that already exist in a way that is either broad enough to encompass neurotechnology or explicitly to encompass neurotechnology provides additional understandings of existing law, rather than inflating the body of human rights themselves to include 5 additional rights.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to add is that, Francesco, if you look at the proposals, as I told you, there's more than 20 proposals for ethical guidelines for neurotechnology now and counting. I forgot to mention the Organization for American States, so it's supporting this. If you look at all these proposals, everyone is in agreement. I'm telling you, the agreement goes even across the industry. Even the companies, the tech companies that are building this new technology are in agreement, protecting mental privacy, protecting agency, protecting personal identity. Everyone agrees with that. So I just disagree with your characterization that there's academic arguments about this. I mean, academics are always arguing about everything. Even if it's raining, people will argue that maybe it's not. No, but this is a wide consensus of that this technology is for the first time enabling the access to the sanctuary, as you heard it mentioned, as the sanctuary of our mind, and this is something that should be regulated. No? So I think what we're trying to do is to take that wide consensus and do something fruitful with that can help us, instead of just sitting there and talking about it. No, how about doing something to fix the problem? And the first step in that is to take a very hard look at what we have now, what do we need to cover, are things covered or not, and that's the gap analysis, and you just heard the conclusion. So, but I don't think there's anything wrong. As the society changes, as technology develops, so should the laws, and so should the regulation, and so should the human rights. Human rights have to be reinterpreted. We're not in 1948 anymore. We have to be in 2022. We have to reinterpret those human rights with the technology and the world that we live in. Thank you.
Hervé, if you want to go next, really, and then I'm going to go to the chat box and do a summary there. Go ahead, Hervé.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I had no time at this moment to go into your very deep and very precise document, but I will read it with great care. And also, I'm sorry I missed most of your presentation because I was just in a meeting for the FENS, which is a European neuroscience meeting that we will have in July, and where we will engage the more than 6,000 people that will participate in the FENS meeting this year in neuroethics activities. So it might be that these neuro rights will be at stake. So I wanted just to congratulate you for this incredible document that will be very helpful, as all the work of the Neuro Rights Foundation that you have done for the last 10 years or almost. And I want to emphasize the fact that we need to be clear on the point that there will be no inflation of new rights, because this is the fear of many that we should want to create new rights. It's very important to say that the basic human rights that are already existing in the treaties are the ones that we want to protect. And as just Rafa said, we want to make this actual. We want to make it from 2022. And I think that the vocabulary of the presentation will be very important, that you identified many gaps. So we need to precise the treaty or to have maybe some work for additional protocols, but no new human rights that should need to rewrite the charter, what kind of if it is a UN Charter or the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. We just want to adapt and be sure that this covers what neurotechnology could do. And we need to be working all together to fill these gaps that you identified in your document, and to work together to use the technology for the best, as we all try to do, and prevent these abusive use of the neurotechnologies that could frighten Katrina. And you are right to be frightened if we are not preventing this. I am at this moment in Montreal for the Time World conference, which is on AI, and it's clear that the big companies of AI, whether they are Chinese or US companies, have powers today to overwhelm any kind of barriers and law. We are trying to protect our individuality or our privacy or our right to think by ourselves, what we name freedom of thought. So it's clear that we have to work all together to try to reinforce these human rights. And once again, thank you for this splendid document.
Terrific. I'm going to go to a quick question, which I know we'd want to address, which was the last one. Then I'll summarize a couple of the earlier ones. Is that how much input has industry had in the creation of the neuro rights? And Rafa, I'm going to direct this one to you to start with. And should they have more input?
Yeah, we're talking to the industry all the time. Just 2 days ago, I had a deep conversation with Thomas Reardon, who runs, he's the creator of Control Labs, and he's now where Control Labs was acquired by Meta, and they've developed some of the most sophisticated technology, non-invasive, that I am aware of, which is a bracelet that records the activity of the alpha motor neurons from your spinal cord. And this has put incredible potential, both for medicine and even just as to enhance our agency as humans. And he's concerned about these issues. And we've had conversations with, I said it earlier, we actually hosted 2 panels last year, inviting probably around 10 different companies to talk about this issue. And it was unanimous request from everyone speaking from the tech company side, that they wanted clear regulation. For an entrepreneur, it's sometimes very uncomfortable and risky to work without knowing what the rules are. So I think they're the first ones interested in developing a clear set of guidelines. So we have some input from them already, and we're actually looking forward to working with them even further with the Neuro Rights Foundation. Maybe Jamie is actually that's part of his goal within the foundation, is to help maybe coordinate an industry consortium to get their feedback. The industry should get a table. We need entrepreneurs. They're the ones who are taking the ideas from the scientists and building products that are the ones who are really sending humanity forward. So they have to be in the industry, but we have to do this job with some basic agreements as to where we're heading and making sure that basic human rights are protected.
Let me just quickly address, because a related question just put in the chat by Alan McKay, which relates to how the regulation of neurotechnology seems to involve a balance between trying not to do anything that would prevent innovation and the beneficial effects while still addressing human rights concerns. And is there a worry about inhibiting innovation? I think this is going to be a clear balancing act that's going to be necessary, and we're going to kind of learn as we go. We sort of have to build the car as we drive it. To give you an example of this, we have a major project underway, which I won't say too much about in a public space, but which is with a major consumer products NGO co-partnering, which is reviewing publicly available neurotechnology products today and looking at the user agreements of those products to see in actual terms what is going on with companies and are consumer rights, human rights, civil rights, privacy rights being respected. And I can say that a preliminary look at those user agreements, I think, raises a lot of concerns because much like we saw in, for example, DNA related products like 23andMe, these companies in general are having one, you agree when you use the product to, upload your brain scan to the cloud, and you've actually just transferred your brain scan to the company. They own it, they can sell it, they can do with it as they see fit. And I think that that's worrying, as it is. And so if you talk about a right of mental privacy, my view, this is my personal view, I'm not speaking for the foundation here, but my view is, we shouldn't prohibit people from transferring their brain scans to companies if they want to do so, but it shouldn't be embedded in a 40-page document that nobody reads. If you want a person's brain scan, then when you're saying yes to that, to that user agreement, then that question should come up. Are you okay with, transferring your brain scan to the company? And, today we can only read a small percentage of what's in there. In the future, we could read a lot more. And are you comfortable doing that? And you should be, ask that question, in my view, explicitly and specifically and narrowly, not just embedded in this massive user agreement. So I think that this is how you have to strike a balance between, inhibiting innovation, but also protecting human rights. And obviously, informed consent, obviously, is a concept from the medical world. But I think when it comes to brain scans, I think it applies. That's in general how I would think if you're a consumer of any product, you would want informed consent if you're going to be sharing brain data with companies that you might buy their products from.
I'll just say two quick points, and then go ahead, Stephanie. Yeah.
Are you answering the question?
Yeah, but go ahead. You go ahead. Yeah.
I was simply going to add that, in terms of industry engagement, we've also collaborated very closely with IBM in every step of our initiative. They're a global leader in trying to prioritize the ethics of artificial intelligence and are more interested in applying ethical frameworks and helping develop ethical frameworks around consequential and transformative technologies such as neurotechnology. And so we've worked closely with Dario Gil, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of IBM Research, in all of our advocacy and meetings with stakeholders. I also wanted to emphasize that in terms of this balance that Alan has raised in somehow inhibiting innovation, in promoting ethical guidelines for the development of neurotechnology, what we're in essence interested in is ensuring that this technology is developed in an ethical way that is respectful of human rights. And theoretically, that's something that industry should be very interested in terms of helping people safely and efficaciously use its products. And then on the other side, in terms of regulation, just ensuring that people are protected when they're using these products. And again, with an eye towards safe and efficacious use. And so in looking at this trade-off, it need not be a trade-off. This is something that industry's collaboration is definitely needed for, because it's something that we all ultimately want, the safe and efficacious use of these technologies. Jamie, over to you.
Yeah, just two, three quick points. Number one is the reality is that sometimes standard setting actually unlocks innovation. So one simple way would be by aligning the interests of researchers and the innovators who are pushing things forward and the end users, people who are benefiting. Sometimes the incentive design of companies around things like data portability and the ability to like share research across bounds within a corporation actually benefits researchers so that things don't get caught in a walled garden. That might be in the short-term economic interest of an individual company to collect more data and to be able to say that they have an IP asset that's great, but it can actually be a long-term impediment to innovation. So aligning the interests of innovation to move forward and the end users and what we want for humanity means looking at the economic incentive design and kind of cultural practices even of companies, of entrepreneurs, of investors, of public markets and the way that they view that. So our engagement with industry will sort of happen in that spirit. The second part, and a bit, Stephanie, to what you were speaking of, is because there is a shadow here. There is a lot of concern about how this can be used. By actually addressing this more aggressively, we might get more people to adopt it faster. And that has its own benefit. And then the third part is we are also interested in equity, right? So it's not just innovation and pushing it forward, and it's not just efficacy, it's not just the ethics, but it's also the equity questions. And we also want to engage with industry to make sure that people of different socioeconomic backgrounds and geographies get access to that earlier. That has both the benefit obviously of the direct well-being into justice, but also that has a feedback loop into innovation because more populations using it means that we can get a faster research and innovation cycle moving. So those, in each of those ways, that's one of the approach in thinking about how we would engage with industry. Ultimately, that comes down to what story people carry and what incentive design structures are they operating on under. This is true both with neurotechnology, it goes to other kind of areas of science and tech, like in genetics and others. So we also hope that this is like a collaborative effort where we can sort of open source the work that's going on here and learn from each other across different spaces as well. I know we had a question of how can people join that, and then I'm going to go back to some of the earlier. Rafa, do you want to address that?
Sure. I think we're running out of time, but to join, to help, if you're interested in what we're doing, please go to our website, neurorights.org. I think the website of the foundation. Sarah will put it on the chat in a second. And we are actually building in a way like councils and teams and networks of people that are interested in this topic, and we are and we have a lot of hard work ahead of us. We're all working essentially without pay. This is just we're a nonprofit. We're doing it out of our own time, and we need help to get the message across and with all the things that we have to do.
Yeah, I think, Jared, what do you want to do? I mean, I'll just say that we will continue. There's been some other questions raised about, obviously, I believe we've touched upon, our concerns about its use for surveillance and other purposes for that. That will be something that we will continue to share and discuss. I know that that's been a concern that's been raised in the earlier questions. Feel free to reach out with us directly to talk more about that. That is something that we are concerned on, both in the direct application of it, but then also, as I sort of mentioned, the shadow, that as people raise concerns, the shadow can actually allow this potentially to be used where people think they're being controlled, even if they are not, and people can give that impression in a way that can yield control. So I think, Jared, do you want to wrap up there? Or how do you want to?
Yeah, I think, we set the event for an hour, so let's, I think, conclude it here. Obviously, this is just the beginning of a very long set of ongoing discussions that we'll be having with the foundation. We'll also be launching something called Neuro Age, which is going to be a vehicle for having these kinds of ongoing conversations, and engaging with the widest array of people on this important work. There is a question about the recording. Yes, the recording will be available. We have recorded this. And it'll be uploaded on YouTube and then available. We'll push it out to all of you and to the broader group of people that we had reached out to about this event. It'll also be on the website of the Neuro Rights Foundation. And we'll be doing lots and lots of events like this, where even if you miss them, the video will be available online as well. You know, we think that the most effective way to advance neuro rights is with the widest array of engagement by all stakeholders. And I think that that's going to be critically important as well. But thank you very much for coming today to our first event, and with the launch of this report. Lots more to come, exciting things to come, and we look forward to being in touch with all of you. So Rafa, I don't know if you want any last comments, Rafa, to bring you to a
just yeah, this is not about us, about any of us or our organization. This is about trying to help humanity together by looking at the future, seeing what's coming, and try to organize our thoughts and our instruments of international law to make sure that this leads humanity to progress, scientific progress, medical progress, economic benefit, and that's that in a way in which it reinforces our humanity. There's no reason why science and technology and humanism shouldn't be together. So that's the spirit. So, and this is a job for all of us, including you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.